Welcome to Quick Look on solid phase extraction. I'm Paula Orens, an ex-scientist, sample prep enthusiast, and all-around chromatography superfan. One of my favorite sample prep techniques is solid phase extraction, more commonly referred to as SPE, and it's used to separate sample components by passing them through a sorbent bed to remove undesirable components by various mechanisms. A long-standing dispute amongst the SPE community is easily summarized by one question: vacuum or positive pressure? Well, with me, I have three SPE experts who are going to help me get to the bottom of the debate. I'd like to welcome Melvin Blaze, Kenny
Hi,
Berthollet,
Paula.
both from our chemistry R&D team, and Katie Brennan from the water scientific operations team. So let's get started with Melvin. Can you tell me a little bit about your SPE experience?
Hi, Paula. I'm always very excited to talk about sample prep and SPE. So thanks for inviting me to this discussion. So to give you a quick background of my experience with SPE, this goes back since 2006 when I started working for a clinical bioequivalence and bioavailability CRO, where we were quantifying statins in human plasma for clinical applications. So that's when I started using SPE for my research work. From then on, I started to learn more on SPE and started to use more and more in several applications. Since then, I've used SPE for a variety of applications, covering a variety of sample matrices, which could be, say, for example, quantifying veterinary drugs in beef extracts, or quantifying glycoalkaloids in potatoes, as well as quantifying drugs and their metabolites in plasma, urine, and other biological matrices. So when it comes to a clean sample that is needed for analysis, I always prefer to go with SPE. So that's been my experience with SPE so far.
No shortage of experience there, that's for sure. Katie, what in your experience have you found especially difficult about SPE?
Thanks, Paula. That's a pretty interesting question. So usually what I find really stressful is when I'm working with plasma. So currently I'm doing a application with oligonucleotides, and I'm trying to extract them out of human plasma using an Oasis microelution plate. And I really have a hard time with proteins binding to my analyte, and then my analyte and all the proteins in the plasma not binding to the sorbent bed of my SPE sorbent. So that's really what I'm having issues with usually, and that's what I'm working with.
And what can you do to combat those issues?
Well, currently I'm using a liquid-liquid extraction with an SPE. And so with the SPE, what I've been trying to do is really slow down the load and elution steps of my SPE so that I can really try and get my analyte to have contact with the sorbent bed. And I have to do that manually currently, and it's kind of hard every time to tell how I should be using pressure to get the exact flow through my bed.
Kenny, have you found any techniques that can help to control the flow of your sample?
So with manual systems like a positive pressure manifold or even a vacuum manifold, what I usually do is I cycle the power of the device. So with positive pressure, I cycle it from off to low pressure, maybe 1 or 2 psi. And with a vacuum manifold, I pretty much do the same thing where I'm cycling it from being on or off. And that really just slows it down even more, because even though it's set to a very low rating, low pressure rating, cycling it like that just really slows it down and maximizes that interaction like Katie was mentioning earlier.
And why is it that the flow rate is so important, Katie, like you mentioned, for the load and the elution step?
It's so important during that step because that is the initial contact of your analyte to the sorbent bed, and you really want to have the maximum amount of time that your analyte is in contact with the sorbent before you go through the different wash steps. And then obviously on the elution step, it's just as important to make sure that you're slowly eluting what you need.
Melvin or Kenny, do you guys have any other general SPE recommendations that we should touch upon?
So one thing I usually see when running SPE is that, especially when you're running SPE in plate format, sometimes some well doesn't flow evenly when compared to the other wells. So some wells flow through very continuously, but some wells doesn't even start to flow when you load the sample. So I think this is common problem that most of them face when doing SPE in plate formats, more particularly. So when that happens, what I usually do is try to increase the flow for a second or 2 seconds so that it gives a boost to those wells which doesn't have a flow. So and then come back to the original flow. By doing that, it pretty much starts up the flow for those wells which have difficulties in going through. So probably
Kind of
others might have to. Yeah.
Re-engaging the pull or push
Yes.
even.
Exactly, giving a slight boost to that initial flow.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining today's quick look on solid phase extraction. Be sure to look out for parts 2 and 3 of the series, where we will continue our discussion to find the answer, whether vacuum or positive pressure will reign supreme. To find out more information about different tools for processing SP successfully, please visit waters.com/auto. See you soon.